Welcome to the Hessian Scrum podcast. I am Raphael, the editor of the Hessian Forum website, and today we'll be doing a roundtable discussion on the topic music and cinema in general, and metal and cinema in particular. And for that, I have assembled quite a team. We have Randal Plunkett, the 21st Baron of Dunsany. Thank you so much for coming up again.
Very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, for those who don't know, Randal was already featured on a previous episode. I had a blast with that one. We discussed a lot of interesting things, including things that we will be discussing again here. And also from Ireland, we have John Pearson from the site Excuse the Blood, who has been featured on the Necropolis podcast. John, thank you a lot for being with us too.
Thanks for having us on. It's a great pleasure. Thanks, Raphael, and thanks everybody else who's on.
And last but not least, we have Jason, from whom you might know from the band Goatcraft or from the podcast Necropolis, the other podcast which is associated with Hessian Forum. He's interviewed some pretty great guests, Paul Ledney, Paul Speckman, etc. So Jason, thank you a lot for joining us today.
No problem. I'm very excited for today's episode. I was looking forward to being a guest rather than a host. So
yeah, for a change.
I know we've collaborated a little bit. You've been on my podcast when my co-host was a little busy, and you filled in for him. And we had Michael Ford on. We had a great chat with him from Black Funeral and the Church of Lucifer and all of that. And talking about high-profile guests, we just had Boyd Rice on last week, and that was a whirlwind. Like, if anyone saw what he posted on the Instagram, kind of trash talking the podcast a little bit, but it's all good. Like he said, it's all good. I'm glad we had him on, and the episode's performing very well, so it worked out for us. So looking forward to the Hessian Scrum today with Mr. Raphael as the host.
Okay, nice. So since we're already, so like I said, we'll be discussing music and cinema today. Let's see where this conversation takes us. But for the beginning, I was thinking about the fact that, like, the first thing that comes to my mind when talking about these things is how these two mediums are naturally intertwined, right? And I don't mean just in that superficial, like the most obvious way, which is soundtracks being such an important part of films usually, but also the fact that some music tries to be pretty cinematic, so to speak, pretty narrative. Talking about concept albums, or not to mention operas. And conversely, some movies try to dispense with the more narrative logic and go for a more musical language, sort of an oniric mood. And Randal, we talked a lot about this on our podcast. And since you yourself are a filmmaker, and your movie The Green Sea, you also try to venture into this more abstract sort of storytelling. So what can you tell us from your perspective as a professional?
Well, I mean, what is music? It's a accumulation of pulses that are designed to create an emotional connection. Now, whether that emotion is anger, sadness, something. And that's what it is. And if you look at cinema, and what is cinema? Cinema is moving pictures. And moving pictures, I mean, if you think about the medium of cinema, it started as just silent films where we had the visual side. And then you had people who would accompany these silent films with maybe live music, right? And as time went on, dialogue was introduced and more feels, because music enhances feeling and visuals accompany that. And that's what a film is these days, or that's what a film is. So, I think when you look at music, it's the most sort of pure state of creating emotion. We use it in cinema all the time to enhance a view. Now, most people never see unedited films, but I can tell you it's very difficult to watch films that don't have music attached or sound in general. It's very difficult. And we as editors have to work very hard to try and create emotions without it. And then we can, add those things that help with our edits. So it's such a, and they say in cinema, 2/3 of film is sound, because, you can see if a shot is bad or it's not quite in focus, people will notice. If sound is bad and doesn't resonate, you will notice very quickly. And that's an industry saying. So, you know, it's it's a crucial state for film, and they are so important when they work together. And it's ironic because music nowadays has kind of ventured the other way, and you see much more video mediums being used to sell music. You know, you see music videos becoming the dominant thing on the media for music. You see people dropping singles instead of dropping albums, so they can have a video. It's kind of inverting on itself.
Exactly, like I was saying, it's they're naturally intertwined. John, you talk a lot about both music and cinema on your blog, so, and culture in general. So what can you offer on this topic?
Well, I definitely agree with something that Randal just said there, in that it's often regarded that films are 2/3 sound, and that's even crossing a medium which has been around since, I think, the 1880s or the 1890s. Going back to a really important and pivotal part of cinematic history, I think, in relation to, I don't know, we're probably going to talk about the adjacency of things like heavy metal to cinema. And to me, the emergence of things like the slasher is a very, very pivotal moment in that. And one particular crucial example of that will be the Alfred Hitchcock film Psycho. And I think that Alfred Hitchcock was on record saying that the musical score to that movie by Bernard Herrmann was 60% of Psycho, in its own words. That soundtrack itself, its dissonance, its kind of staccato rhythmics, it's just a very, very pivotal, inseparable part of what you have in that movie. It's something you hear as much as you see.
I 100% agree with that, definitely.
Yeah, and Jason, your project Goldcraft, I would say it has a very soundtrack feel to it. Like many times listening to it, I get the feel that it would really fit into a survival horror video game, or even like a slasher maybe, or like an haunted house movie. So, what will be your perspective here?
Oh yes, the second album that I did, called Blasphemer, it was based on the works of the paintings of William Blake. And what I did with that is I created a piano piece and ambient pieces to specific paintings. So in a kind of way, it really is a soundtrack to the paintings, not film. But yeah, I can see how there's a little bit of overlap, because I do encompass some ambient aspects, like dark ambience, and you know, really abrasive piano music. But going back to what Randal was saying, he was talking about music transitioning more to like music videos nowadays. Like that's completely true. Like there's really like this huge like digital aspect of music nowadays, especially with the bigger pop stars and all of that, where it's all driven by music videos on YouTube and all of that. Spotify, even like Spotify has video capability. Like you bring a popular release and there's like a little video that plays with it. I saw that with the new Dune soundtrack. There's like little clips from the movie when you're listening to the Hans Zimmer soundtrack. And there's really this huge emphasis on the digital consumption. It's like, I would say it's like a little bit on the periphery of what music used to be, like where you would go out and buy physical media. Is more, I don't want to use the word disposable of being online. It's like you get, you know, the music that way, but it's not as permanent as owning a record, where you're using the streaming services to listen to it. And, you know, metal might be like part of the old guard that still has the physical media aspect, but even looking at CD sales from the past 20-30 years, you can see like how the past 10 years have just been like the other side of the bell curve almost. Like it's just decreasing and decreasing every year, and especially now with the pandemic, with the vinyl plants being all clogged up, physical media, I think, is going to take even a bigger blow. And what Randal was saying is like music videos online, I think that's just going to be more and more prominent as time goes on.
Yeah, and you know, it's interesting that you say that, because we are looking at from the TV world. Now we were looking at the American numbers, and it happens that DVDs have gone up in sales, which is bizarre, because In America, I think the more dominant, I might be incorrect here, but I think the more dominant physical media is Blu-ray. And it's different here where I live. I mean, DVD is still very much the dominant medium in the physical world. But DVD sales have gone up. And 4K is still very small, and Blu-ray has I think went down a little bit. And it sort of comes with the digital age, I suppose, because if you think about it, once the CD came in, we started listening to albums in a different way. There was a lot of the ability to skip tracks and pick the ones you like. And I suppose that was sort of the first step into slowly not listening to albums in their entirety. There used to be so much emphasis put on arrangements, particularly in the vinyl era, because you had to really be choosy which song was going to go where. All these things made a lot of difference. And then I suppose with the CD generation, we started being able to have the flexibility to choose. So big song arrangements became less important because people were going to pick the songs they liked or the tracks they liked. And I suppose with the streaming generation, it's even enhanced that even further. Now it's all about playlists. And, even the idea of albums are becoming almost redundant in many forms of music because we are spoiled for choice. It's very much become like the YouTube attitude where we go from video to video. And, it's very difficult. I mean, I don't see a lot of people sitting on albums for full albums unless they are listening to vinyl. Because even myself, I find myself doing it. Now, I'm a big advocate of physical sales. One, for the way that it helps the industry, but also for the fact that I actually really like the idea of CDs. I grew up with CDs and vinyl, and for me, there's a personal enjoyment of it. I still prefer the way it sounds. I feel that there's more attention put on it, but it is something, unfortunately, that I suppose is going to probably end with my generation, because I think the next generation have no interest in those, and perhaps I'm wrong. Maybe the 15-year-olds will get into CDs again, but there won't be any CD lasers left because that's the other problem. There's nobody's manufacturing the actual physical hardware anymore. A lot of the companies that used to produce CD drives no longer do.
It's interesting because with these predictions that I've heard about the music industry eventually becoming completely single-centered, which is very much in accordance to the tendencies of our culture. And since we're doing this parallel with cinema, there's something very similar happening on that realm, which is if in music we're moving towards with streaming services and going from single to single to music video, and in the cinematic arts we're also seeing that a very similar phenomena with Netflix and binge watching the TV series. It's all about a much shorter format, much more indicated for the ADHD generation, so to speak.
Well, that means there won't be those 25-minute Doom records anymore in the next 10 years. 25-minute tracks are gone.
Yeah, not the 7-hour movies like those by Bela Tach, for example, the Hungarian director.
Yeah. Well, but you see, this is also the problem, right? Because, the music industry, it's a bit different, I suppose, than the film industry because you have less hands involved. So with music, obviously, sure, a lot of artists can create things. I mean, there's a lot of solo artists who can multi-instrument, who can play lots of instruments. Or nowadays, because of the benefits of the digital side, they don't even have to play instruments. They can literally put things on a timeline, and suddenly they've got drums and keyboards and all kinds of stuff. This isn't quite the same thing happening with the film industry because you still need actors, you still need people to do things. And so there's still a lot of money and crew required for you to make a movie or even make any kind of video. And the demands for video are still very high, where the technology benefits of music have improved quite a bit. You don't need the same studio that you needed 20 years ago. You can do quite a lot with a DIY studio. One could say the same thing about cinema, but you still can't get past the fact that we still need very heavy quality cameras. People still expect special effects. They still want this, that, and the other. And the way we consume film and TV is still very different than what we do with music, because Spotify and things like that are very much the entry points for most people. And that is pretty much a huge library where things like Netflix don't actually have that much stuff. So if you're an independent filmmaker doing anything, should we say, a little bit against the grain, you really have quite a few, should we say, gatekeepers to get through before you can even get your film on the platform. Where with Spotify, I don't think you have those same gatekeepers. You can make abrasive noise for 25 minutes. And you probably have to pay a surcharge to Spotify, but you can probably get your stuff on Spotify without much go. Then the rest is down to you to get people to go and listen to your 25 minutes of distorted sounds. Where with film, it doesn't work like that. We work is still in an industry that needs to buy and sell. And, people are very much, Netflix especially, they pick their projects. There's certain things they like and certain things that they don't like. And if you do anything different, they won't like that. So, there is still very much less access, because I think most people don't realize how many films are actually made every year and how many of those never get seen because there's no way to see them, really, in the current arrangement of how we consume our media in its largest way. I mean, obviously, there's lots of stuff you can buy on YouTube or whatever, but it's very tricky. And how do you get people there? It's tricky because it's so difficult to see how the industry will transform as a business. And I think it's somewhat sad and somewhat refreshing, because it means people have to be very savvy with what they do with their product or what they do with their art. Because let's be honest, this is art. So how do I get people to buy into it? And that's the same across both platforms, but it's definitely more difficult because of the necessities in cinema. And I see a lot of solo artists coming in. I think there must be more solo artists coming in of the metal alternative scene than I've ever seen before. You have so many one-man armies. And even if you look at the sort of the popular, what the kids are listening to, which is, I would argue, is sort of the emo rap thing, has become like a big, big thing. It's all solo artists, because solo artists are cheap to do tours. It's cheaper to you're not sharing profits. Spotify revenue makes some sense. A lot of that stuff came from SoundCloud and YouTube. I mean, a lot of my friends who still do the metal thing, I mean, they're still cutting 7 inches and doing LPs. And, they got to fly a band around the place. It's very costly still to go on tour and make money. So there is a sustainability aspect to the music that we're used to. And I would say cinema's even worse.
Yeah, definitely. That was one of the things we discussed on the previous episode. And yeah, that's definitely true. We did agree that cinema requires much more, like you said, much more. It has other necessities that music simply doesn't have to have. And it's also much more difficult to put it out. But when we were talking about the streaming services, I was comparing more in the sense of the formats. And I would actually argue that the situation is actually more similar than it seems, because, indeed, like you said, with Netflix, they do the selection themselves. They only put out what is popular and what they know will sell based on their algorithms. But, with Spotify, I think it's not really much different, because the only difference I would say is that it's the people themselves who make that selection. Because, of course, you can have, like on Spotify, you can have any random like drone doom band by who only has 3 listeners a month, but it will eventually die off. So it's as if it wasn't there. So in a sense, I would say it's they end up converging towards the same state of affairs, right?
I mean, you could argue that is the case, but the thing is, there's access is there. You can find it. And that's
already something
very interesting. I mean, that's already half the battle is first being accessible. The second thing is then how do I get the people to go? And that's the same thing the cinema industry has, because how do I get you to click on my movie when you have so much, when you're spoiled for choice? And I'm also against the clock here. Music can be listened to, many different types of music can be listened to in very short form. Cinema is slightly more complicated because you need more of a commitment. You need a 90-minute commitment. And this is the interesting thing for me, and I think what's happening with cinema is ultimately, I don't know if you've noticed, the lengths of films are dropping. If you go on Netflix now and you click in the horror section, you'll probably see a lot of movies that are going for 80 minutes, 70 minutes. And that was unheard of many years ago. And probably you will see in time, and it hasn't happened as well because they had a couple of streaming platforms that were looking for short form, very short form. We're talking 15-minute videos and clips. Now, I think it was, I'm trying to remember the name of the Quigley or something like that, that they tried and it flopped. So people aren't ready for that yet with their video medium because they have YouTube. But I think music is funny because, you know, it's I'm not saying that grindcore sales are probably going to explode in the next 10 years, because I don't think anyone's going to be running to the hills for that one. But at the same time, it is very difficult to get films and to get music out there, because nowadays you're competing against everyone. And that's the problem. It's like now it becomes about marketing. And because that's the thing, you can sell your death metal band, and if you look, you could be a Cannibal Corpse copy. But if you're just a Cannibal Corpse copy, how do I get people to come and listen to my Cannibal Corpse copy? Then it becomes about image, it becomes about media. And written media no longer exists in the same way it used to. So now it becomes about being interesting with how do you get people to that? And that's the next step. It becomes about being a salesperson.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, I definitely agree. I would say the state of affairs with alternative music in general is very much like that. You know, it's become kind of a business in itself. You know, I would say that most of the sales are based on that, on how, you know, which sites you manage to promote your music, that kind of stuff.
On one side of the spectrum, streaming has been great for some, emerging directors out there. Like I had S. Craig Zoller on my podcast quite a few months ago, and he did that movie Bone Tomahawk, which had a very, very, very limited theatrical release. It barely made anything from the box office, but the movie got out there because it was put on Amazon Prime, had Kirk Douglas in it. So the marketing aspect is like, hey, there's a new Kirk Douglas movie. It's a Western. And I guess it was just timing too, because the Questionable Eight or whatever it's called by Quentin Tarantino came out around the same time of Kurt Russell. Did I say Kurt? I meant Kurt Russell. And it was also like set in a Western setting. So once Bone Tomahawk started streaming on Amazon Prime, it reached a very large audience at that point and started getting more and more reviews. And I saw it and I thought it was amazing. I actually hit him up, brought him on my podcast, and got to learn about him quite a bit. And I'm looking at just the figures from Bone Tomahawk. In the box office, it made less than $500,000. But the budget was $2 million. But, streaming, they're generating revenue from that somehow, whatever the contractual terms are of, Amazon Prime and all that. But it's just amazing that, streaming, for some directors, especially emerging ones like Craig Zoller there, it really put his name into the mainstream consciousness. So that's one good aspect of streaming. What are your thoughts on that, Raphael?
Well, like we've been saying, I think it's a double-edged sword, because like we were discussing, it's it's a massive market, like with a lot of, like Randal was saying, a lot of options. So, and I guess eventually ultimately it comes down to, a lot of it comes down to marketing and promotion, and a little bit of it will have to do with how the algorithm, directs people to certain things that they like based on, all these, like the data mining. I think that's pretty much the situation. Yeah. So anyone else want to?
Here's the funny thing, right? Now I can't talk about Bone Tomahawk specifically, but what typically happens with a lot of success with streaming is also, you have to consider one other thing. A lot of those are still distributed by distributors. So the distributor puts the film online. Chances are the distributor is making the money, because and this is what happens. It happened in our situation as well. Like, we were given our movie was purchased by a distributor. They put out the movie, and to be honest, I mean, when it comes to revenue, I mean, I don't think I need to tell you boys at all about how that works with the music industry. think everybody can agree that making music is very, very tricky to get revenue, especially when it comes to streaming, because the distributors and the record labels used to swallow up all the money. It still hasn't really changed in the film industry. And when people buy movies, they buy them at market usually. So Westerns, it's interesting that you picked that one, because Westerns are very difficult, notoriously difficult to make money on, because Americans are really into Westerns. So the American distributors purchase it, but they don't do very well outside America. Yeah, you might get a bit in the UK, you might get a little bit in Germany, but generally it's not a genre that does very well financially outside America. So you'll get a good solid block of money from a buyer in America, and you'll be sort of like, it'll be drips and drabs from the rest. But what, and again, I can't talk about Bone Tomahawk specifically, but what happens a lot of these things, that they will be just given a flat out rate for their movie. Here, we'll give you 100,000 for the territory of the US, for example, or maybe more. And then all the pay-per-views end up in the hands of the distributor. And I think, and I may be wrong, but I think, what's the company that owns Lionsgate, if I may be wrong, but I think, isn't Bone Tomahawk owned by Lionsgate? I may be wrong.
It could be. I can look it up. Well,
and I'll tell you something, Lionsgate is notorious for being very, very hard to satisfy, and they tend to make a lot of money. And I have heard many stories of many producers who don't make a lot of money. They do a deal and it's a big distributor, but a lot of that revenue never makes it back to the hands of the producers. Now, like I said, I can't speak about Bone Tomahawk. They might have been in a place where they could have gotten more. But like even myself, much of the funds that are made on clicks on Amazon Prime and all the others will probably be swallowed up by the distributor.
Yeah, it was RLJ Entertainment. It wasn't Lionsgate, it was RLJ Entertainment.
RLJ.
Yeah. And the production company was Caliber Media. So they might have just had their own thing. And I know, like with Spotify,
they might have had their own deal. You see, it's all very different. It all depends on them. And like I said, they might be put out. It really varies depending on who you are and the kind of deal you can make. But it again, like I said, the issue becomes with these things is how much of it actually gets back. But that's always been the case in the music industry as well. So it's no different.
Well, I saw a video the other day. I should speak about how we consume media today. It's like I saw it on YouTube, but it was breaking down how everything's divvied up with Spotify plays, for instance, and Apple Music. And it seems like the major recording artists out there, the pop stars and all that, they're the ones that kind of get a good chunk taken out by the record labels, but the independent artists out there on the streaming media, they actually make a bigger cut. But then you have to take consideration they're getting way less listens, so it's it's not going to be that much money from these streaming services. But I think it was like, if you're an independent artist, it was like 60%. But then if you sign away all the rights to a record label, then you'll get pretty much nothing. But the major labels, the general rule with that was the record labels would take a much larger cut. But then again, they're investing a lot more into it too, so they're trying to make that return and profit on it, whereas independent artists out there, they don't really have that marketing strategy and the money behind getting the names and all that out there. So it's kind of a tug of war almost with these streaming services, because on one side, like, there is money to be made there, but it's just really hard to market it and all that. You really have to be a breakthrough artist, like an independent artist, to really capitalize off it. So I don't know. It's like the digital media consumption, I see that just growing larger and larger and larger. And who knows what the future holds. Like Bandcamp, I talked about Bandcamp quite a bit in my own podcast, but they only take a 10% cut. So if you're an artist and you put up your own music on there, they only take a 10% cut, and it's not through a record label or anything like that. And then the rest is just pure profit for yourself. So if you're a breakthrough artist and you distribute your music that way, through Bandcamp, you could possibly make way more than like Spotify or Apple Music and all that.
Oh, absolutely. I'm a huge lover of Bandcamp. I think Bandcamp is probably the savior of music, actually, because they do allow, you're bringing the audience straight to the artist. I mean, you buy your, whatever it is, you buy your CD or your vinyl, or you just buy a digital download. It's there, it's yours. You can have, you're not squashed down by compression. You can choose your format. For me, Bandcamp is probably the most superior of all of those things. It gives you a lot of options, and you have an ownership of the music, and you engage. You know, I buy a lot of Bandcamp, and I'm a big fan of that. And the thing is with Bandcamp is, it is good to the artist, and they've been doing great work during the COVID for creating these Bandcamp Fridays where they give all the money to the artist. And that's, I mean, it's really something that Spotify should have been doing, really. But they won't be doing that. But Bandcamp has, and it's fantastic what they do. But yeah, you're absolutely right. They do have, and that's their best platform to buy stuff. But I don't know how much the numbers are, and maybe you know this, Jason. How much of the population actually uses Bandcamp regularly? Because I don't know, I noticed recently they started allowing you to stream and download things on a phone and create a bit of work on the apps. But do a large contingency of people still use Bandcamp to purchase music?
Well, I think Bandcamp is one of those things where more of the collectors are there rather than casual listeners. I think Apple Music and Spotify, that caters to the mass public, whereas Bandcamp is really the people that are actually into music. You know, they don't hold it in adornment like most people, like background music and an extension of their personality. They're into it for the gravitas of it, you know, whatnot, and metal and rock and all that. So yeah, I think there's different crowds for those platforms. I don't see Bandcamp making headlines all the time like Spotify and Apple Music does, but I'd imagine they're getting quite a bit of revenue through that platform. But I just see Spotify completely dwarfing that, because you know, Spotify is always in the headlines. There's always ads out there for Spotify, and this seems like a major business compared to Bandcamp.
Yeah. Well, in any case, the question remains, which is whether or not someone will make a movie equivalent to Bandcamp to counter the mainstream streaming services.
Yeah, I sort of see it a little bit happening with YouTube, because YouTube, I mean, it was originally just, you know, it was free, but now YouTube has a huge amount of video to rent and to buy. And YouTube is owned by Google, and they have more money than everybody else, let's be fair. And actually, to be honest, and I don't know the percentages, and I won't be able to tell you this till the new year, because we're expecting our financial data to come in the new year from our film revenue. And I'm curious myself to know how many people bought and rented our film from YouTube over, let's say, one of the many others, like Amazon Prime, for example. Like Amazon obviously has two different variables. You have Amazon, the free Prime, and then you have Amazon, the store, which you can buy and rent. And I'm very curious to see what the ratios turn into. Now, obviously, it will only be with my own project, but at least I'd be very curious to see how many people go to one or the other. Now, me personally, Amazon doesn't even sell to Ireland properly. Like, so I have to go to YouTube. So perhaps it's not a fair, considering it's an Irish film, perhaps it's not a fair, show of how it really is.
Well, I was just remembering, there actually are some so-called Hindi streaming sites for movies. But again, like I'm not really sure. I have no idea how much they sell, what are the numbers. But okay, anyway, so after this discussion about the more business side of things, I was thinking now of steering the conversation to our secondary topic, which is the metal music in particular. And I'm just remembering that one of the first, the very first article I ever wrote for Hessian firm was called Hessian Cinema, and it was basically a guide, a short guide for metalheads looking to find movies that reflect the themes of heavy metal. And so in that sense, I was going to ask you guys if you have any suggestions of movies that you would consider metal.
The Lighthouse. certainly The Lighthouse.
The Lighthouse. I would definitely agree with The Lighthouse. The Lighthouse.
I'd certainly say that all of the films done by Jörg Buttgereit, which includes both necromantic films, Der Todesking and Schramm, would perfectly fit the aesthetic niche of what a metalhead should look for in terms of music and aesthetics in a film, and vice versa.
Yeah, well, that taps into a whole new topic, which is that, well, of course, this is a very vast subject because metal is not really that homogeneous. I guess, well, obviously there are some core themes that are shared by most of the bands, but within metal there's a lot of possibilities. There's the more epic, glorious, the more bright side, like power metal, or even like the classic heavy metal, more adventurous and more inspired by like heroic narratives. And of course, there's the other side, which is where that director comes in, which is the darker, cynical, like the nihilist side. And in that side, in that realm, I would say it's interesting because I actually didn't come up with this one in the article, but I think it's like also absolutely one of the most exemplary movies that you can come up with, which is Tetsuo, the Iron Man, a Japanese movie. Not sure if anyone here has seen it.
Absolutely.
I think it's a personal favorite. I think it really captures. If we are to make the comparison with heavy metal, I would say it's that kind of the harsher industrial, like Godflesh mixed with a bit of black metal, maybe, like a really nightmarish vision.
Well, to me, that movie is a perfect hybrid of David Lynch's Eraserhead and David Cronenberg's Videodrome, with all of the aesthetics and ideas perfectly merged into one.
Yeah, I would say that's a very good description. Usually when people talk about that movie, they usually come up with those two precisely. With David Lynch, I would say, yeah, Eraserhead. We talked a lot about Eraserhead on the episode with Randal. And David Cronenberg, yeah, and plus with a pitch of this whole industrial thing. Like I would say, the movie actually has a pretty good industrial soundtrack, and the guy who made the soundtrack, I'm not remembering the name exactly, but he also
Yu Ishikawa, I think, is the name.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, thanks. And he also did just a curious note. He also did some soundtracks for Takashi Miike, which is also another Japanese director, which I think fits very well into this aesthetic realm.
Yeah, and the thing is, as a director, and that was Shinya Sokomoto, I think that's how you pronounce his name. He was in I don't know if you ever saw Ichi the Killer.
I think that's the one that has a soundtrack by Shu Ishikawa.
Yeah, so he's a bit of a genius on his own level, and he acts, he does all these things. And he did another one. I'm just trying to find it. I think it had something to do with Bullet. Oh, I'm just trying to see the name of it here. Yeah, he did another one that I don't know if you guys have seen it. Have you seen The Snake of June? That was another movie that I would class as metal. That and Tokyo Fist.
Yeah, Tokyo Fist also veers a lot into the Cronenberg aesthetic.
And these are movies, if you think about it, they are very much an alternative kind of film, because we are dealing with very dramatic themes. It's very visceral. There's a lot of it's body horror, a lot of it, and the thing is, it very much creates something that's avant-garde, really. So it pushes the envelope of extremities, and yet they are not movies that are per se mainstream, like the alternative music scene. There is very much like very extreme tiers, and they're not for the masses, as I would argue these movies are not. Another one I was going to mention, I don't know if you guys have seen it though, it's fairly obscure. Have you seen the Austrian film Angst from 1982?
It's brilliant. It really
it is.
I think I don't know that one.
It's phenomenal.
Yeah, can any of you describe it then?
So I'll let Randal go because he mentioned it first. So
no, I think John, you can take the cake on this one. You've been fairly quiet up till now.
Yeah, look, so basically, I just made a quick mention prior to Angst being mentioned of the films of Jörg Buttgereit, which is The Toad's King, Necromantic 1 and 2. He did those in the late 80s and early 90s. Angst, I forget the name of the director, but that was put out in 1983. And it's nearly everything in that movie is done from sort of a POV point of view. It's done with kind of a first person view in the camera angling and everything. And it has this really very disturbing soundtrack by the German progressive electronic musician Klaus Schulze. And it's very overlooked. Not a lot of people mention it, but for anybody who is looking for something deeply disturbing and violent, but also very artistically accomplished, it's really good, a real gem.
And
yeah,
unfortunately,
I just remember that one. Yeah, I wasn't just funny. I didn't really get the name. I didn't hear it right, but yeah, Angst. Yeah, now I really remember. Indeed, it's fucking phenomenal film. I think that movie was also very. It was really visionary, I would say, because they did in, I think, 1983. They were already doing the thing that, for example, Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, tried to do, and a more recent example, the house that Jack built by Lars von Trier. This whole shtick about doing the movie from the perspective of the killer. But I would say Angst does it better than, like, it easily surpasses any of those. The way it completely immerses you, like, in the mind of in the state of mind of the killer, and the way he perceives the world, and this really cold, apathetic mood. It really, it's hard to describe. I think people really have to see it. It's quite an experience. Yeah.
and Gerald Cargy, who was the director, he self-financed this film, and he got I forget the name of the cinematographer. I have to look it up here, but they was very interesting because the point of view shots that they were doing, a lot of it was used through mirrors. I don't know if you know that. They filmed the whole film shooting across mirrors and reflecting the images, because it was, if you look at, one of the most notable things about the film is the way it looks and the angles that they have. And what they even did in some of the shots, where they actually built like an actual suit for the actor to wear, which they placed the camera directly in front at an angle. And so often they would even use a second angle where the mirror would reflect it back. So in terms of the sheer madness of it, they shot that movie, and the cinematographer, if you actually listen to him talking about the film, he said a lot of the time they didn't even know what they were shooting. And there's one scene in particular where he's running through the forest and the camera is moving overhead. Now, we have to remember there were no drones at this time. And there was also, this was a very low budget film. And they were drunk during the making of it as well, I believe. And they would tie the camera to a rope. And they basically went down, moving the camera along a rope, which basically was extremely crazy. I mean, if you think about it, this is being a first feature. And the sad thing about this film is it was largely forgotten. It's only got very, very limited distribution even now. I happen to have a copy. For me, it's one of the lost classics of time in cinema. And it's very sad because it did everything correct. It broke boundaries. Its theme and its protagonist was so dark, and it should have been one of these cult films that everybody should be watching. But unfortunately, it's, even today, I think there's only 2 distributors in the world who sell it.
Oh yeah, impressive. Both the details about the filmmaking and that fact, which I agree. I remember from the very first time I saw it, it was a very obscure film, and I had the immediate impression it should have been, like you said, a cult film, to be worshipped by that type of audience. And I was just remembering, I actually featured that film on the article that I mentioned, the Hessian Cinema article. And another one quite similar in terms of just the pure extremity, although much more abstract, which is Begotten by E. Elias Murridge. I think that's how you pronounce it. Does that ring a bell to anyone?
Yeah.
Sorry, say Begotten, yes?
Yeah.
Yes. I actually haven't seen that one, funny enough. Looking at the picture of it now, I think that has exactly everything I'd want in a movie in once.
I think I forget it was a good few years ago since I watched that, but one clear aspect of that movie is there's barely any verbal dialogue in it. It's mostly about the visuals and the disturbing sound throughout it. But it's extremely monochromatic, even for a black and white film. It's incredibly grainy. If I'm not right, the director, I think something like for every, I don't know whether it was for every second or every minute of film, there was at least 1 hour churned into the editing process of getting the right texture for that, apparently. And it's very, it's a really messed up one, but for metal adjacent cinema, it's definitely a worthwhile recommendation.
Yeah, well, I would consider that one like the closest thing to the incarnation of like black metal in cinema, because it's all, like you said, it's very non-verbal. And I've heard in an interview the director saying explicitly that he wanted to create something very primal, like something that came from the unconscious directly. And the film really does that successfully. It has a very it really feels very like incomprehensible, like esoteric, obscurantist on purpose. Like it comes from the depths. It comes from below the below the rational mind. So yeah, I think it's like you said, very much a great choice in this topic. Yeah.
And that was called Begotten.
Yeah, Begotten from 1991.
That sounds really cool. Just something that John was talking about, I think it was about angst, how it was shot in mirrors. That drew parallels with Trey Azagoth from Morbid Angel. When he went to record some of the guitar parts for Gateways to Annihilation, he actually put a glass bowl over the microphone to his amp, just to kind of capture a different type of texture and all that. Like he did a lot of experimentation. And I'm sure there's a lot of that, like in metal, where people are trying to use different methods to record and all that. And you can look at the Swedish death metal scene with the Boss HM or heavy metal pedal that they used, just to kind of get that different type of texture and all that. And a little outside of metal is like Brian Eno with his ambient music, with how he recorded that, I think, on loops. So there's a lot of really cool, experimentation that's going on in both metal and music and film. Also, just to kind of backtrack back to The Lighthouse, I draw a really great parallel to black metal with that film, because, aside from the mysticism and the lore and, I think that, there's a lot of Greek like lore in there. The way it was filmed and edited and all of that, it was black and white. It wasn't widescreen. It really, it's like black metal of low production, just raw and, gritty. And, you're there for the quote unquote composition more than the visual representation that's on screen, even though the acting is phenomenal, especially with William Dafoe. But I draw a great, black metal parallel to that specific film. Of course, the same director did the same writer, he did The Witch as well, which is, very kind of satanic movie. So I think metalheads will definitely flock to those two films.
This is perhaps not such a metal thing about Robert Eggers's two films, but I think it's relevant to metal in that both The Witch and The Lighthouse, they are American films. But when people ask about what is an American film, they usually have a very specific and modern idea of what an American film is. But what I love about both of those films is they are American, but they are particularly Anglo-American. And the time setting for both of those films is set, on the East Coast and in the era when the first settlers obviously were coming to grips with the new land that they were in. And to me, there was something very Lovecraftian about both of them, potentially. And there was something very folkloric for both of those as American films, which they're both kind of considered folk horror films. And I think the idea of that those kind of things are very, very lost on a lot of people in filmmaking, or the way that a lot of people look at film. They had more in common with a lot of English folk horror in terms of their aesthetics, but they were of American people, or some of the first settlers of America. And those things that might be very obscure to some people, I find really just brilliant and awe-inspiring.
Yeah, I think
yeah.
I think The Witch, that initially drew a lot of interest because, like you were saying, the American folk side, and everyone knows about the Salem witch trials and all that. And then we have this movie, even though there's no witch trials or anything, there's people, casted out from polite society into the wilderness. But I think the initial interest of that movie was because just all the historical backing around, that area of the U.S. with the Salem witch trials and all that. But the movie was, completely different than, the historical aspect of that area. But it really delved into like that folkloric mysticism, I would say. And you never quite know what's going on in the film until the ending. And so it's just like this great mystery that's slowly unraveling. And I think that is one of the best things, to experience in film, where even some films that don't really click, throughout, but when you sit back and ruminate, you're able to put all the pieces together, later, like after watching the movie and things like that. I think it's a really great statement that I think his name is Robert Eggers, he was able to capture. So that's my 2 cents on the lighthouse. And great point about how it's kind of like derived from like Anglo-American history, with that part of the US. I hadn't really considered that, but nowadays, like you're saying, for American films, like it's just a really diverse cast all around, and that kind of went against the grain, the Lighthouse and the Witch of mainstream Hollywood.
Well, I know that it's not something that I've actually seen, but you mentioned the Salem witch trials. I've never actually seen, I think it was done as a short TV series, Salem's Lot, but that was done by Toby Hooper, the same person who would have done the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which is an absolute classic by all means.
Yeah, the Salem witch trials was just, people were really, really, orthodox, and they thought people in their community were witches, and they burned them at the stake. But yeah, I don't think there's really been like a lot of recent, at least recent movies on that. But everyone in America knows about the Salem witch trials. And I think, as time goes on, it's over exaggerated. It probably wasn't, like rounding up 50 girls and burning them to death. It was probably just, a few, but it's just kind of that, how even like you're talking about like how old American, Anglo-American stuff was. It was very, Christian and all that, where it really ties into the witch, where they're casted out from polite Christian society and thrusted into the wilderness.
I definitely say that in terms of like metal adjacent cinema, and we've mentioned 2 American films there, that's also got a crossover with some Hammer folk horror that would definitely include Witchfinder General, and also The Wicker Man, which is a more modern take, but still nonetheless really good in the way it deals with superstition, local folklore, even things such as Freemasonry, which I found to be quite apparent the last time I watched The Wicker Man around Halloween. But those things do really overlap well.
Yeah, and it tends to focus on something that's very interesting in British society, which is the sexuality. And that's something that it was challenged. I mean, if you think about music as a whole, it's always been trying to push boundaries of emotions. And the repression that you had in the UK, especially, and it was a direct challenge from the Hammer horror films, because they were very sexual in nature. You had a whole culture of these very big-breasted women, and all this kind of stuff was very much the forefront of that. And that was attacking that part of British society that had been so repressed for so long. That was one of the things that I was really interested in, particularly in The Wicker Man, how they got the guy as a virgin, and the whole story was geared around around tempting him, and all the sort of subcontext of religion put into it. And it's something that I wanted to bring up as well. Have you guys seen the film Performance?
Yes.
By Nicholas Roeg.
I think actually, because
so.
And sorry if I'm going off on a tangent. We talked earlier on about how film has been changed as a medium, and it's been rendered more immediate, and it's been rendered something which, I don't know, there's been more and more things over history, and we've talked about social media, we've talked about stuff like YouTube, Spotify, streaming, that's kind of rendered, it's kind of risks shortening the attention spans of people, and people always talk before that about the music video. I know that Performance, I think Nicholas Roeg directed that, if I'm not right. It's one of the earliest examples of cinema where the idea of the music video seems to be piloted. This was obviously, it was 1970, so it's at least 10 years before the advent of MTV and the music video being a common thing. But you do see that coming into the fray, and again, really, really good movie.
Absolutely, and it's very interesting from a sonic perspective, because they were doing crazy things with abrasive sounds. If anything, one could almost make an argument that it's like a Merzbow and Boris collaboration in the soundtrack, because it's so many abrasive sounds and attacking, meanwhile juxtapositioning with very aggressive, very abrasive edits, which are not usual. And again, with this sort of underlying theme of sexual repression and violence all mixed together, which, I mean, if anyone who's looked at any death metal cover in recent years will see that all of those themes are very much in our culture of interest. And another one that I kind of felt that did something very similar as well was, did you guys ever see things like House from a completely different perspective? If you look at House, Hosu, the Japanese version from 1977, you have this very abstract, very, again, aggressive way of shifting styles. And it's so over the top in terms of its extremities that it would be the equivalent of something on the far end of our culture. But they use very similar, although they were in two different parts of the world, they use very much the same fundamentals to present these stories. I mean, Hosu, I don't know if you guys have seen it.
And it's a pretty interesting movie as well, from that perspective that you're saying. But I wanted to go back to the folk horror, and indeed, I think that mystical aspect is probably the most interesting part of it. And we're seeing a revival in that kind of horror, exemplified by the likes of those movies we were talking about, The Witch and The Lighthouse. But and it's an interesting thing that that this type of stuff, like in culture, kind of works by cycles. And because if we think about in the context, like the evolution of the trends in horror cinema, there was a period like in the 90s where the trend was mostly in the opposite direction. It was more like urban horror, and I'm not even talking about popular stuff like urban legends or the like, but things like the Japanese movies, like Dark Water, or all those movies that were all about not just very far from the Hammer context of like finding some abandoned castle, but more horror that is right in your face, that is in the a person you can identify with, some random person who is working lives in the city and lives in an apartment, and he finds something mysterious and horrific about that completely changes his view on existence. And so it's interesting that nowadays it is, I would say it started more or less. I think The Witch was pretty much the not really the first, but probably one of the most important points in the revival of the more folkloric type of horror. And when we were talking about the sexuality, for example, that really plays into the whole thing, because it's, in a sense, it's it's sort of an old trope, which is this that of a society that is kind of sheltered. The Witch depicts that very well. It's a Puritan. There are Puritan settlers, but or even like The Wicker Man, British modern British society. and suddenly, also obviously Christian, but suddenly they find, an eruption from within, like an eruption from the subconscious that is completely invading, the daily life. And, that subconscious, in the context of a Christian society is usually portrayed, obviously it's usually associated with paganism and mysticism and all of those things, all of those tropes that those movies are going back to. So I think it's a pretty interesting movement that we're witnessing. It tells a lot about the interests, of like contemporary culture from a sociological point of view.
Yes, just to chime in, just kind of about The Witch and Lighthouse. Robert Eggers' new film is coming out soon. It's called The Northman, and it's actually in the 10th century about Vikings. So I'm presuming he's going to go really deep into like some interesting aspects of like Norse mythology or Viking, mysticism or something like that. And William Dafoe is going to be back in it, so definitely going to be checking that one out. It should be a little interesting, and he's also taking a little divergence from just like old stock Anglo-America into like even older stuff. So looking forward to that one and what he does with the mystical side of Vikings. So it should be really cool.
Absolutely. I mean, keeping on the folk side, I mean, another one that I felt that was very interesting, and it's more of a modern approach to this, was A Field in England. I don't know if you guys have seen that.
I've heard of it, but I've not seen it, but I've heard good things.
And again,
same here.
Like with it's basically it's a very low budget film. I forget who made it now. It's
Ben Wheatley, right?
Ben Wheatley, that's it. Thank you. And it was very interesting because, again, low budget film. I think the budget was only about 300,000. And it's basically very cheap. They were three guys in a field or something, and there's loads of supernatural things happen to them once they're in. They take magic mushrooms, and it all goes pretty crazy. But like with The Witch, they shot in black and white. Sorry, not The Witch, The Lighthouse. They shot in black and white. They used a lot of weird distortions with the lenses at certain points to create these very uncomfortable settings. And it's interesting to see how the evolution of the folk horror has happened, and I've been sort of, it's been something that Ben Wheatley definitely has an interest in. I'd say, looking at what has been done with The Witch, I would say there's almost like a mirroring going on in the UK with Ben Wheatley's films. Like they're doing very similar kind of ideas, or they're approaching the same idea from very different polar opposite areas, yet they're sort of meeting somewhere in the middle, because a lot of their films, they have a lot of similarities.
Yeah, I have to check out Ben Wheatley's films, not just A Field in England, which you definitely spiked my interest even more on that one, but also
he did another one called Kill List as well, which was also very much.
That's the one I was gonna talk about. Yeah, but go on.
So no, the interesting thing is, these are, if you look at them, I mean, looking at it from a film perspective, what's interesting about Ben Wheatley's career is that he is a guy who started with very low budget films. So they're very almost B movies in the way that they're made. He often works with and even today, he still likes to work low budget. He tends to go for these very over the top kind of ideas, very stylized. And I mean, Kill List itself, at the beginning, when I first started watching it, had almost like a soap opera kind of feel to it. But then it juxtaposes it with this kind of traditional, almost like Hammer horror kind of feel to it. And gradually, as time went on, it became something else. It became almost it sort of evolved. And much like the same with The Field in England, he did these kind of evolutions. And I would say his films, just like Egerton, is that his name? Egerton?
Eggers.
Eggers, I beg your pardon. Just like Eggers, he has this kind of this style, this what I call this nouveau horror style, which is for me very interesting, because they're not tripping on the traditional scare horror, which gets everybody into the cinema all right, but these slow building kind of tension filled sort of surreal horror, which is for me my personal interest.
Yeah, so we've been really talking a lot about the more horror side of it, which is natural because, well, it's metal after all. But like I said in the beginning, metal is quite vast. There's a lot of sides to it, and I would like to steer the conversation more in the opposite end. So the more epic, the more power metal type of thing, and in that sense, there's always those cliche movies, like those cliche choices, like Conan the Barbarian or Excalibur. But would any of you offer like anything else, maybe something not as known, but that still fits that type of the more power metal and classic heavy metal type of aura?
Anything on Beowulf? Excalibur, you just mentioned that, and it might not be as well known today as it was 30 years ago, but that movie was completely epic. It had a lot of Wagner in the soundtrack, and Wagner is arguably very metal. And I think there's two different versions of that movie, where like one's like the TV version where it's like PG, and the other one I forget. I was a little kid when I initially saw it. I haven't seen it in quite some time, but there's some really like gory scenes, like a bird pecking out a guy's eyeball, and things like that, where it's not really PG, but just the soundtrack and the epicness of it. I know you wanted to gloss over that, skip it for more lesser known things, but I would say that's a great just movie all around for just the sheer epicness of it. So yeah, definitely the Wagner music insinuates that quite a bit, listening to the Wagner motifs underneath the epic scenes in the movie. But yeah, there was that CGI movie that came out a long time ago about Beowulf, and I thought that was pretty cool. I mean, it was cheesy because of the CGI, but I think just the story of Beowulf is really awesome, very epic and very metal. Let's see. I like the new Dune movie. I know this, huge production CGI, and I know John here, he wrote an article, not really into it as much, but I thought it was very faithful to the books. And there's some dialogue sections that were cut out that wasn't faithful to the first book, but overall I thought he did a phenomenal job, and especially when you just look at the thing, it's very beautiful and it's very epic in size and scope. So I enjoyed it. John had varying miles with that.
John, what do you have to say about the new Dune now that Jason has challenged you?
Personally, I came into that knowing that Denis Villeneuve was going to adapt a film version of it, and I certainly don't mind some of the previous films that he's done. Like I quite enjoyed the film Prisoners, which he put out, and I also quite enjoyed the sequel to Blade Runner 2049 that he did. But I just felt that with the new Dune, I just thought it was there were many things that I could say about it, and I've written a quite scathing review of it in a big essay that I did on my blog. But I felt at times it was far too technically perfect, and it sometimes felt hard for me to watch it and discern whether there were any unique touches by the director to it. I know that I'm saying something which could end up being very unpopular, but I've seen the Lynch adaptation of Dune countless times, and for all the flaws which are present within that adaptation, I just felt that there was so much more to that was endearing than Villeneuve's current version. There are obviously many things in the new version which will, titillate modern audiences and modern film goers, who won't be looking for something that's, let's just say, otherworldly or avant-garde or profound. They will look for, let's just say, something that the average Game of Thrones viewers might look for can be found in there. That's, of course, why they cast people like Jason Momoa in it. But I just felt that even despite its accuracy to the storyline and obviously the director wanted to commit himself to some sort of accuracy, I just felt it didn't really jump out at me. It lacked a lot of depth, and yeah, it was a real misfire, if you want to ask me. That's an unpopular opinion, but I stand by it.
Yeah, well, I can agree. I read the article that you wrote, and I agree with you on one point, being that the soundtrack wasn't on par with 1984 Dune. But I think, modern movies with soundtracks, they just go for ambient texture more than like, themes, I should say. It's not really themes in a lot of these movies. It's just generic, cinematic music, or like epic, cinematic, which is like wallpaper. And they did enlist Hans Zimmer, and he did pull out some quirky type of textures, with the bagpipes and vocalizations and things of that nature. And I listened to the whole soundtrack, and throughout the whole thing there's like really like two ideas or musical ideas or themes, that strings of motifs that he stitched together, and it's really not much going on in the music itself. It's just like a backdrop to the visualizations of what's going on in the movie. And I do want to mention that talking about how pretty it looks, you said it might be too faithful to the source material, too clinical, just keeping it, all the ducks in a row without diverging much. But the lighting that was done in that movie is like real world lighting that you would see in reality. Just the shadows and all of that. Whereas in most like high budget CGI movies, there's very, very fake looking shadows, or no shadows where there should be shadows, and things of that nature. And Villeneuve did a great job on ensuring that the movie visually looked great, and even from a technical standpoint with how the shadows are and all of that. So I think it was one of the best looking movies I've seen in a very long time, honestly.
I myself, I sort of haven't made my mind on that movie yet. Like, I guess I liked it the first time, even if just on a superficial way. And I do think they get a lot of things right. Obviously the visuals and the epic scale, that's not even debatable. And you already knew they were going to nail that before you went in. But I also have to agree with John on the fact that I guess a lot of depth from the books was kind of kept out, I think, namely with the backstory, the characters. And it's interesting because one of the most praised aspects of that movie was how they split the book in two. They made a really huge movie just about the first half of the book. And yet I think it was very, very rushed, like I'm just thinking of when they arrive at Arrakis, and there's basically no, the dialogues in the book where between the Duke and his son and Paul, all of that was very, it was either completely removed from the movie, or it was very fast. And I was just giving an example because there's other equally important things that I think weren't really as present in the movie, and especially from the point of view of someone who never even read the book. That must be completely confusing. All those names and all those all those bits of backstory that don't have the contextualization that they deserve. And so, for that reason and a few others, I guess I had the sort of, when I watched the movie, I had that lingering feel that was kind of a Marvel adaptation of Dune. Maybe I should watch it again and see how, if my opinion changes or not.
I think it's
just something else there as well, is that obviously there was a lot of hype around that film, and there was a lot of hype as to, the question being, is this an adaptable movie? Can an adaptation of this book commercially succeed? And it was clear after a couple of weeks, after some good box office returns, that commercially it was a success. And before the film actually came out, there was a lot of hype as to whether the whole first novel of the series could be adapted into a film. And it would be reported back that would depend on the success of the film adaptation of the first half of the first book. And I think it took about a fortnight for Villeneuve or those producing the film to then state, look, yeah, we're definitely going to produce a second film. It's going to cover the second half of the novel. But I remember, I think it was around a press release when Villeneuve confirmed that they would film an adaptation of the second half, that, the first film was more talking, the second film would be more action. Now, of course, within that whole novel franchise, there are areas which there's a lot of world building, and there is obviously more action. But obviously, the people who are producing this know that there needs to be action and more superficial parts potentially in order to titillate an audience. So I just remember seeing this press release saying, we're going to do a second film, but it's going to be more action and less talking, with the notion in mind that they want to appease certain types of moviegoers rather than... It's very clear that compromises have had to be made in putting that film together in order for it to reach something. And I guess to back up some of the critical comments that I mentioned before, was that before I watched it and before knowing what I'd see or seeing what I'd see on the screen, was all of the hype suggesting it was going to be a good film was already possibly planted in the minds of those who would see it, and it was marketed to many of them before they actually watched it. Now, I was going to be expecting, in relation to the terms of the hype, something on par with 2001: A Space Odyssey, or something like Stalker by Andrei Tarkovsky. But what I got was, a blockbuster movie with, some impressive aesthetics, but it was, if I was to watch a lot of other movies of that kind of genre or that aesthetic underpinning which have been coming out of Hollywood lately, I wouldn't really know how to differentiate it from a lot of other movies that were coming out now. If you excuse my rant.
It's okay. It's okay. Just to chime in on one last thing on Dune before we get back to metal relations, because we kind of drifted off topic. So I think it was yesterday or day before yesterday, James Cameron came out and said that Dune is not at all like the Marvel cinematic universe, which it really isn't. We talked about the visual aspect. Those Marvel movies are very heavy on CGI. They look very unrealistic watching them, and they all kind of have the same plot, just regurgitated over and over and over. And James Cameron actually came out and said that it was very different than the Marvel movies, and that's a big Hollywood name who did the Avatar movie, which is a big CGI thing, but he's catching some backlash on that. And it's kind of funny that an A-list director in Hollywood is actually saying that Dune is substantially different than just the average run-of-the-mill Marvel movie, which is Marvel's the biggest franchise right now. It's even bigger than like Star Wars and all that. So just one thing I kind of wanted to bring up that really transposes to metal music is that early like death metal scene in Tampa. Like when Death was getting going, that band Death with Chuck Schuldiner, him and Cam Lee, they would go to the movie theater all the time and watch Evil Dead over and over and over and over. So Evil Dead was a huge influence on their band, and you can kind of see that in the lyrical content, like Zombie Ritual, just kind of like a 80s horror flick type of death metal band. And even Entombed from Sweden, they had the Phantasm melody and Left Hand Path. So there's like this great aspect of 80s kind of cheesy horror that was like in the foundation of the early death metal scene.
Well, I think to an extent that also counts for a lot of the movies of Lucio Fulci. I think to an extent in some of the lyrics for Scream Bloody Gore that some of his films like City of the Living Dead influenced some of like what Chuck Schuldiner was penning down on that. But yeah, there is also this big if you're talking about death metal, at least, especially the more gory end of death metal, then I think the mutual association of some of the more gory Italian directors, be it Lucio Fulci, Umberto Lenzi, Ruggero Deodato, and maybe to a lesser extent Dario Argento, that there's just a really big parallel with some of the explicit violence of their movies and the content and their aesthetics, maybe even some of the art and the posters for what they put out, and the actual, let's just say, aesthetics of death metal itself. I just think that the two are just very, very well intertwined.
I think that's a great example that you bring up, because I think Lucio Fulci in particular are, well, like you said, to some extent, all of those Italian directors, they really captured that, like I was saying earlier, that more abstract, like oniric type of language. Even though, like, for example, The Beyond by Lucio Fulci, it might, on a surface level, it might just appear like a, run-of-the-mill, lowbrow gore flick, and it kind of is that in a sense, but it also has this, I think I personally find it very interesting, this like more disorienting feel of a nightmare or like a fever dream. I'm remembering of one scene in particular where they are, I think the main characters are on an hospital, and they are running from these zombies or like living dead, and they go to an elevator, and the elevator impossibly takes them to some place that is completely unrelated, like some sewers, and then they walk a little bit into the sewers, and like out of the blue, they meet a post-apocalyptic landscape. And so you see that's really a very good example of the type of thing I mentioned earlier, of when movies try to dispense with more narrative logic and completely go for this more emotion-based like fever dream feel. And I guess that's also very visible with, for example, Suspiria by Dario Argento.
Yes, and I think one of the interesting thing with those films is, on the surface they were very lowbrow and etc., but actually quite a lot of those movies had quite intellectual statements. I mean, if you look at and we're going to talk about Romero here for a moment. If you look at Dawn of the Dead, for example, I mean, it was making very heavy criticisms on American culture of the time, of this consumerism and things like that. And the Italians were doing much the same things. And so I think a lot what we're seeing with those kinds of musicians, they were looking for, apart from on the surface of the aesthetic, they were also trying to say very much the same things in their music. So I think they were more sensitive to these aspects. And I think that's why they ended up being so intertwined. And if you look at, I suppose, I mean, going back to the early 90s, those were very dominant. I mean, Dario Argento was in his prime back then. I mean, he was doing a lot still. It was sort of the end of his career, really, in terms of the best of his films came, I think, up till 95. But he was still very much in the mainstream. Like, he was definitely one. And then you had a lot of the zombie trends in 80s had just finished, where there was a lot of quite thoughtful films that were, again, low budget, but had quite a lot of metaphor within them. And I think if you look at bands like Death, they had a lot to say. But the problem is, a lot of it was lost on people just hearing the surface noise. And I think that's always been the sort of a bit that's been misunderstood with a lot of the more extreme metal music. People just, because they can only hear one aspect of it, they can't see beyond it. And I think that's one of the reasons why it sort of fits very well with horror specifically, because horror is a very interesting medium for telling stories. And there are a lot of thoughtful horror films, but many people are just not able to get behind a horror film. I always typically meet people and they say to me, "Oh, well, we couldn't watch a horror film." I'm like, it's a very big, bold statement. Can't watch a horror film because it's too much. It's too, and that's what I hear the same thing with music as well. Oh, I could never listen to stuff like that. But then again, you look at what does that mean? I mean, are we talking about the quality of the music? Because if you listen to what's happening in death metal or what's happening in thrash, there's a lot of technical stuff going on there, and it's very difficult to paint all of the huge genres, just like death metal and horror films, in that painting by numbers, because there's quite a lot of should we say, these tidbits within the music and also within the films, but often from an intellectual point of view that's obscured in the motifs.
Right. So for Death, they have that song Zombie Ritual, which I don't think is commentary on commercialism, because I'm looking at the lyrics right now. And just to read this, and pardon my French because there is a bad word in here. It says, "Revengeful corpse out to kill. Smell the stench, your guts will spill. Vomit for a mind, maggots for a cock. With his axe, the corpse will chop. Stare into his eyes. Now in a spell, kiss the rotting flesh." So that doesn't really seem like commentary on consumerism, but they could be, drawn into, the like that really was like the beginning of a great subculture that Death was a part of, back in the tape trading days of death metal, where they're really against, the disco and mainstream music. They formed their own group away from commercialism. The harshest textures imaginable, like Possessed came out, and Death took, I would say a little bit lighter approach than Possessed did, but then Autopsy was there, kind of, upping the game a little bit too. And I could see how just like the subculture formed around like anti-mainstream sentiments, which horror movies has a great relation to with their development, throughout time. And it's always going a little bit against convention, against romance movies, against, big epics and all that. No, it's just, we're going to show you some horror, and there might be some messages there with it. And it's really done, I'm not as fluent as John and yourself and Raphael, but it really seems like horror movies have become a little bit more sophisticated with the messages that they're communicating. It's not just, an Evil Dead movie where, you're chopping down deadites and all of that. So it seems like there's much more, almost like metaphysics in it, more embedded messages and like a meta narrative and things like that going on in the movies.
I just wanted to bring up again, because I've been kind of shilling Jörg Bucherite's films, especially the two necromantic films and Der Todsking, otherwise in English, The Death King. And what's interesting about all of those films is they deal with very, particularly necromantic, they deal with, well, death and sexuality, a huge deal. But Jörg Bucherite, the actual director, tried to say and rationalize that they were just films about love. Of course, though, these films were very, very extreme. I think they were some of the first German films ever since the end of the Third Reich to get outright banned or censored by the German authorities. And if you do watch them, there's a very raw, grainy way to how things are done, whether it's the camera work, whether it's the actual special effects which achieve the gore, and the soundtracks as well. They're just, I've watched some of these films very recently again, and I kind of just even watching the aesthetics and then listening to the soundtracks, and even having watched a quite rubbish film like Lords of Chaos recently, where there's a lot of strong attention to detail despite how poor it is at times, I definitely get the idea that the likes of Euronymous and Varg were casually consuming Jörg Bucherite's films at the time they came out, considering that all of their most prominent work was done in the early 90s, and all of Jörg Bucherite's best work was all in the late 80s and early 90s. It's very worthwhile, in my opinion, to watch his movies, listen to the soundtracks, and then try and ingest the music of the personalities behind the Norwegian scene to see what they might have been taking in.
Well, I guess this is a pretty old trope in a sense, the way that people completely like immediately dismiss something just because of the pulp aesthetics. But both music and some horror cinema, like we were saying, does have beneath that cover does have some interesting messages or themes. And I think another great example, and it's by someone that we already brought up today, Videodrome by David Cronenberg. It's a movie that has this very gory aesthetic, but I think the themes are getting more relevant. It's one of those movies that gets more relevant each day. Like, it was first targeted at like the consumer culture, more built around TV and media, etc. But I would say that with what we have today, with the social media and computers, etc., it has gotten even more faithful to reality. Anyone want to comment on this one?
Well, something that's more pertinent about a film like Videodrome is, day to day, is it's the media that we're using now is much more immediate than it would have been at the time a film like Videodrome was put out. People didn't do Zoom calls in the early 1980s. People didn't have social networks in the early 1980s. But the way people could access technology and get a complete link to it was also completely different. But as well as that, there's this really brilliant theme in that whole movie about the relationship between man and machine, or man becoming wholly integrated into the technological circuits. And obviously, if you've watched Videodrome, that's the transformation that James Woods' character undergoes, is that he becomes fully integrated into Videodrome, and his separability from violence becomes absolutely one. It becomes complete. It becomes like a transhumanism of sorts. And it's really powerful in that regard. But also, what's also fascinating through that whole piece as a film of body horror cinema is that you also, it's quite overlooked, is the score by Howard Shore gradually disintegrates from a classical or a string-based orchestral score, and it gradually becomes more and more electronic. And that kind of progression of the whole movie itself, it's meant to symbolize the progression from a more organic man to an inorganic, digitally integrated type of human, and it becomes a less organic score. It becomes more synthesized. And if you excuse me for, let's say, my stream of consciousness there, it's a really interesting commentary in that regard.
And
yeah,
I would
compare it. Sorry, go on.
I was going to say, it's interesting that we've gone to Cronenberg, because Cronenberg has been a guy who's been saying this for a long time. If you look at his earlier films, like things like The Fly, he was always into this sort of, mixing things together in terms of, you see in The Fly, obviously, the man becomes, technology changes him, and he becomes part of a symbiote with a fly. If you look at Crash, it's people becoming one with the machine damage. It's celebrating the destruction of their bodies by destroying and almost like reinventing themselves through this structure. But I wanted to talk a little bit as well and go into that from Existence, which is probably a film that often isn't talked about when it comes to Cronenberg, which I suppose is the sort of the younger and cheaper brother of The Matrix in some way, where people are plugging into their worlds. I mean, it's interesting now that we use social media and all these things as a main tools of our abilities to express ourselves, and how so far along a way back then it was already being said that by Cronenberg, but in different ways. And again, mixing the organic. And if you remember Existence, they were these kind of like almost organic type things that they plug into their spines and things like that. So it was very much mixing the flesh with the technology. And if you look at Tetsuo, the way we were talking back at the beginning of this conversation, all of these aspects of the reinventing of our bodies and our minds through technology or through some sort of manipulation is been very, very fundamental to where we are today. And if you look at how we even communicate with each other, and how all of these things have become vital parts of our existence, it reminded me very much of how those themes were pushed in his earlier films. I actually haven't seen Videodrome in a very, very long time, and I think I might have to see this movie at the end of this conversation. But I remember very much that Crash was something that held me a lot in that respect. It's that man becoming part machine. And it was this great sequence, I think, and it was Rosanna Arquette. She was almost completely metal because she had all these braces on her legs, and how they were, examining the destruction of the body through metal. And it was so cool. It was such an idea.
Yeah, well, that's why I said it's a very relevant movie. Well, Videodrome is a very relevant movie, but all of those movies that Randal also mentioned are as well, because John mentioned transhumanism, and that's a very, I would say that's a huge intellectual trend right now, and it's only going to grow. And about the merging with the organic and technology, the way technology changes us. I'm remembering a book by Stanislav Grof about the Swiss artist H.R. Giger, which is also very a huge artist very relevant to heavy metal. He did some covers for Celtic Frost and other bands. And H.R. Giger he also does something very similar to Cronenberg. Of course, a very different aesthetic, but similar in the sense that it's all about the merging between like technology and nature, and of course from a very pessimistic point of view, like the idea is that the nature is the part that gets lost in that transformation. So yeah, like I said, so all of this feeds back into our discussion about how this kind of medium, like the extreme music and extreme cinema, despite the appearance, often has some pretty interesting ideas, not just abstract ideas, but some that are very relevant, very close to us. And I think everyone living in today's world kind of relates to this. Okay, so I think we really went through a lot of topics today. Like we covered a lot of movies, a lot of ideas, from the more business side of things to the connection between like metal and the cinema, etc. So I'm not sure if anyone wants to add anything else.
Randal, what is your movie called so I can check it out?
The Green Sea.
Excellent. I'll check that out. Looking forward to it. Please
do. I hope you like it. There is just one thing I think I wanted to say before you guys all leave. It's very interesting to see the personalities shining through, because you see this so much in the entertainment business, and you see it in music particularly. You have these characters, these rock stars, and I don't mean rock stars in the sense that the crass way, but I'm talking about personalities and these expressions, these fundamentals. I mean, if you look at the music scene, it's full of them. These tortured souls who yet they can't really communicate in their own lives. Often they fall off the wagon, and you see the same in the film industry as well. There is a short supply of truly great artists, and I think one of the things that I'd like to see in the future, I don't know if you guys would agree, but I would like to see a lot more of these kinds of artists mixing together, because what there is a bit of at the moment is a bit of snobbery when it comes to soundtracks. It's been very difficult to get sort of alternative music into film soundtracks, into the aesthetic of cinema. We've done it as an influence, but not as using it to express emotions. And I think that is partially because of snobbery. And I think that's very, very sad. I certainly have tried to put it into my films because I think we're missing a lot of what could be used and utilized. And there's a lot of very, very good emotional expressions going on in that scene.
Yeah, it's a very interesting thought to wrap things up. So yeah, okay. I want to thank everyone again for this pretty lively discussion. So Randal, Plunkett, thank you a lot for returning.
Anytime.
Okay, and John, also great contributions by you. I also urge our listeners to check your website, Excuse the Blood. Very interesting analysis on the topics that we discussed today, music, cinema, and also culture in general. And so, yeah, thank you a lot for being with us as well.
Thank you very much, guys. An absolute pleasure. Anytime.
And Jason, thank you as well for your appearance. And I also make the appeal for our audience to check out your projects, your band Goatcraft, and your podcast Necropolis, on which I have appeared quite a few times as well. Yeah,
Yes,
so thank you.
It's great to see you blossoming with the Hessian Scrum here, and you doing your own episodes. I really enjoy it, and it's great to be a guest on this program with you being the host. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, anytime, man. Okay, so I think we're done.